How often do we walk past someone on the streets without a second thought? How many times have we looked away, pretending not to see the hunger in their eyes, the desperation in their trembling hands? We convince ourselves it's not our problem, that they must have done something to end up there, that it's easier to ignore them than to ask, what happened? But what if the man sitting on that cold sidewalk wasn't just another homeless guy? What if he was a father, a soldier, a man who once had a family, a home, a name? What if, instead of looking away, someone finally recognized him? This is the story of a man the world forgot and the son who never stopped searching. Before you turn away, watch till the end. Because next time, the person you ignore might be someone who once meant everything to someone else. No, it can't be. The wind carried the words away before Michael could process them, but then the man stepped closer. The disbelief in his eyes burned into something hotter, sharper. You? You have the nerve to stand here? After 17 years? Michael flinched. Something in his chest tightened. He had spent years being ignored, humiliated, treated like a ghost. But this was different. This wasn't just anger. It was personal. And as the man took another step forward, Michael felt it deep in his bones. His past had just come back to claim him. Before we dive in, let us know where you are watching from today and what time it is. Also, don't forget to hit the subscribe button if you like this story. The sea of Chicago's forgotten. The streets had become his home, the cold pavement his bed, and the indifference of passing strangers his daily reality. Each morning he awoke before the sun, shivering against the chill that crept through his threadbare coat. The city around him roared to life. Car horns blaring, hurried footsteps echoing, conversations merging into an endless hum. But none of it was meant for him. He existed on the outskirts, a ghost moving through the world of the living. His most prized possession was the weathered cardboard sign he carried wherever he went. The edges were frayed, the ink smudged from years of exposure, but the message remained clear. Used to be someone. Most people never read past the first word. They glanced, scoffed, and walked on, their eyes filled with either pity or irritation. Others didn't even bother looking at all. And then there were those who found amusement in his suffering. As Michael stood on a busy downtown sidewalk, a cup of spare change trembling in his hands, he caught the attention of a sharply dressed businessman. The man was in his late 40s, carrying an air of arrogance that clung to him like expensive cologne. He slowed his pace, tilting his head as he read the words on Michael's sign. Then he laughed. It wasn't the laugh of someone amused, it was something cruel, something sharp, the kind of laugh that made Michael's stomach tighten even before the words came. Used to be someone? The man mocked, his voice dripping with disdain. You look like you've never been anyone. Michael kept his head down. Experience had taught him that responding only made it worse, but silence wasn't enough to spare him. The businessman sneered, then with a casual flick of his foot, kicked Michael's cup. Coins scattered across the pavement, rolling in every direction. A few people turned their heads at the sound, but no one stopped. No one said a word. Michael's breath hitched as he dropped to his knees, scrambling to gather the loose change before it disappeared into the storm drains. His arthritic fingers fumbled, the cold metal slipping through his grasp. Above him, the businessman chuckled. Pathetic, he muttered before striding away, merging back into the crowd like nothing had happened. Michael sat there for a long moment, his hands frozen mid-motion, his body aching, not from the kick, not from the cold, but from something deeper. Something that had settled inside him years ago when he first learned what it felt like to be nothing. He exhaled shakily, forcing himself to his feet. He had no choice but to keep moving. The scent of food hit him before he even saw the vendor's cart. A hot dog stand stood on the corner, the steam rising in the winter air, carrying with it the intoxicating aroma of grilled meat and warm bread. Michael's stomach clenched painfully. With the few coins he had managed to salvage, he approached the stand, his shoulders hunched in a posture of quiet desperation. "Excuse me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you have any leftovers, anything at all? I have a little money." He held out the coins, his palm open, hopeful. The vendor barely spared him a glance. His expression twisted in disgust before he waved Michael away like he was shooing off a stray dog. "Not enough," the man grunted, "and I don't serve your kind. You're scaring away my customers. Get lost." Michael nodded once, swallowing his pride along with the lump in his throat. He turned away, the hunger in his belly now accompanied by a deeper, heavier emptiness. Each breath. Spotting a public water fountain near a park bench, he shuffled toward it, ignoring the stiffness in his joints. As he bent down to drink, a presence beside him made him pause. A young mother stood just a few feet away, her toddler's small hand grasped firmly in hers. The little boy held an empty water bottle, waiting patiently for his turn. Michael straightened, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. He tried to smile at the child, just a small, tired curve of his lips. The little boy's eyes widened. Michael lifted a shaky hand in a wave. "Hello there, little fella," he said softly. The mother reacted instantly. She yanked her son back, her face twisting with open disgust. "Don't look at him, sweetie," she hissed, loud enough for Michael to hear. "Come on, we'll fill your bottle somewhere else." Michael watched as they hurried away, the mother's grip tightening as if proximity alone could taint them. He had lost count of how many times he had been treated like he was something to be feared, avoided, something less than human. But it never got easier. Shoulders slumped, he turned away from the fountain. The park ahead stretched out before him, the wooden benches bathed in the golden light of the afternoon sun. There, at least, he could sit for a while. As he settled onto the bench, he let out a long, weary sigh. For 17 years he had existed in this city, invisible, forgotten. And as far as the world was concerned, he was never coming back. The world moved on around Michael, indifferent to his existence. The distant sound of honking cars, the chatter of people on their phones, the rhythmic tapping of hurried footsteps on the pavement, all reminders that life continued, with or without him. He slumped against the park bench, the ache in his bones deepening. The hunger in his stomach had settled into a dull, familiar pain. The humiliation from earlier still clung to him like a second skin. He had long stopped counting the number of times he had been kicked aside, ignored, treated as if he were nothing more than a stain on the city streets. Then, cutting through the noise of the city, a sound reached his ears, a soft strumming. At first, it blended into the background, a fleeting note lost in the hum of the world. But then a melody emerged. It was slow, gentle, yet filled with something deep, something raw. Michael lifted his head. A young man stood not far from him, adjusting the strap of his acoustic guitar. A portable speaker rested by his feet, its battery-powered amplifier carrying the song through the park. Then, the first lyrics left the musician's lips. Michael's breath hitched. It was a song he knew. A song from a different time, a different life. A song he had once played on his old radio while fixing breakfast. A song he had hummed absent-mindedly as he folded tiny clothes while a small child watched him with sleepy eyes. A song he had sung softly once upon a time when life had felt simple, when he had a home, a family, a purpose. The words fell from his lips before he could stop them. Used to be someone, his voice cracked. It was barely above a whisper, rough from disuse. But it was there. For the first time in 17 years, Michael didn't feel invisible. His fingers trembled as they reached into his pocket. He barely had anything left, just a single dollar bill. Crumpled, worn, but real. He rose from the bench, his legs weak, his movements slow. Every step toward the musician felt surreal. His hand hovered over the open guitar case. A few bills and coins were scattered inside, left by passing strangers who had places to be. Then he let the last of his money fall into the case. It was all he had. The young musician looked up, startled. Michael gave the smallest nod, nothing more. And as he turned back toward his bench, his heart ached in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. For a fleeting moment, just the length of a song, he wasn't just another homeless man. He was someone who had once mattered. The warmth of that moment carried him for a while, but it didn't last. It never did. The streets of Chicago at night were different. The artificial glow of neon signs reflected off wet pavement. The smell of grease and city grime clung to the air, and the further Michael walked, the more the streets changed. Less polished, more forgotten. He turned down an alleyway. Then a sharp voice, raised, angry. Michael stopped. Just a few steps ahead, a homeless man was backed against a dumpster. His body was frail, his hands raised in a silent plea. In front of him, a furious store manager loomed, his face red with rage. "How many times do I have to tell you?" the manager snapped, his voice echoing off the walls. "Stay away from my store." The homeless man barely had time to react before the first shove came. He stumbled back, his body hitting the cold metal of the dumpster with a dull thud. Michael's body tensed, the way the man crumpled to the ground, the way he raised his hands in a helpless defense, the way the anger in the store manager's voice burned. Suddenly, Michael wasn't in Chicago anymore. The smells changed, the air thickened. Heat, sand, gunfire, the whistle of bullets tearing through the air, the shouts of soldiers, the desperate screams of the wounded. Michael's chest tightened. His breath came in short, ragged gasps. He could feel the weight of a gun in his hands, the unbearable heat of the desert sun, the chaos of war. Then, the kick. The store manager's foot connected with the homeless man's ribs. His mind shattered. The world spun. The alley blurred into something else. A burning building, a fallen soldier, a heartbeat pounding in his ears. Michael stumbled backward. His body convulsed. The past was swallowing him whole. "Stand down, Carter." The phantom voice rang in his ears. A voice from a time long past, a time he could never escape. "Michael, stand down." His hands shook violently. His chest heaved. He was drowning in memories he couldn't control. Then it was over. The store manager finished with his attack, spit at the man on the ground, and stormed back inside. The homeless man scrambled to his feet and ran. Michael remained frozen. He could still feel the heat, the gunfire, the weight of it all. The city sounds returned slowly, the distant honking, the hum of traffic, but his body didn't stop shaking. He needed to shut it out. He needed to make it stop. There was only one way. The neon glow of a liquor store sign flickered in the distance. Michael's feet carried him there without thought, without hesitation. The bell above the door chimed as he stepped inside. The clerk barely glanced up. Michael's hands shook as he reached for a bottle. The cheapest one. The one that would make him forget. He placed it on the counter. $3, the clerk muttered, his tone disinterested. Michael reached into his pocket, but he already knew. His last dollar was gone. He had given it to the musician, his hands clenched into fists. His body screamed for relief. Then, as if in a daze, he grabbed a second bottle. "How many?" the clerk asked, already tired of waiting. Michael's voice was barely above a whisper. "3. The last of his money." He handed over the bills, the ones that could have bought him food, shelter, but none of those things would make the memories disappear. The clerk twisted off the cap and shoved the open bottle toward him. Michael took it and drank. The burn was instant. It spread through his chest, numbing the ache. The city blurred. The past faded. The gunfire stopped. As Michael stumbled out of the store, the bottle clutched tightly in his hands. He felt nothing. And that was the only thing he wanted to feel. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the Chicago streets. The alcohol coursing through Michael's veins dulled the sharp edges of his pain, numbing the memories that clawed at his mind. But the relief was fleeting. It always was. His legs felt heavy as he wandered aimlessly, the empty bottle clutched in his trembling hands. He hadn't even realized when he ended up back in front of the same high-end restaurant he had passed earlier. The scent of freshly cooked food hit him like a punch to the gut. His stomach twisted painfully, reminding him of the meal he could have bought with the money he had spent on liquor. But it didn't matter now. The hunger was easier to ignore than the memories. He sank onto a bench just outside the restaurant's grand entrance, his back against the cold brick wall. The world moved around him. Well-dressed couples, businessmen laughing over their evening drinks, waiters balancing trays of expensive meals. He didn't belong here, but he was too tired to move. His eyelids grew heavy, the alcohol dragging him toward unconsciousness. Just for a moment, he thought. Just a few minutes of rest before the cold set in again. Then, a sudden shift in the air. The low hum of a powerful engine, the unmistakable hiss of tires against pavement. A sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb in front of the restaurant. Michael barely stirred. The door swung open. A man stepped out. Sharp suit, polished shoes, presence. He moved with the kind of confidence that came from power, wealth, control. At first, Michael didn't care. He had seen men like this all his life, men who had everything while he had nothing. But then something strange happened. The man froze. His footsteps faltered. His gaze locked onto Michael. For a moment, the entire world seemed to pause. Michael felt it then, that unmistakable weight of recognition. Even through his drunken haze, he could tell. This wasn't just another passing stranger. This man knew him. Somewhere. Somehow. A slow, shaky breath left Michael's lips as he forced himself to meet the man's gaze. There was something in the man's expression: shock, hesitation, disbelief, and then something even deeper: pain. Michael didn't understand it, didn't dare to. Before he could speak, the man reached into his pocket. A crisp stack of bills. Without a word, he extended them toward Michael. Michael's breath hitched. It wasn't just a few crumpled dollars, it was a lot. More than he had held in his hands in years. His fingers twitched at his sides, but he hesitated. Why? Why was this man looking at him like that? Why was he giving him this much money? Why did his voice shake when he finally spoke? Here, get yourself something to eat. Michael stared at the money, then at the man. He wanted to ask who he was, why he was doing this. But before he could gather the courage to speak, another voice cut through the moment. Come on, Daniel, let's go. The spell was broken. The other businessmen, two men in equally expensive suits, were already heading toward the restaurant entrance, unbothered. To them, this moment was nothing. Just another rich man tossing a few bucks at a lost cause. Michael could hear them laughing as they walked past. What a waste of money. He'll just spend it on booze. Michael's throat burned. They weren't wrong. Daniel hesitated for one more second. Then, as if shaking himself out of a daze, he turned away and followed his colleagues into the restaurant. Michael sat there, staring at the money in his hands. It felt too real, too strange. His head spun. He had been ignored for so long. Treated like nothing, like a shadow in the background. But that man had seen him, and somehow it had hurt him. The moment didn't last. It never did. The world was quick to remind Michael of who he was. A nuisance. A problem to be removed. He barely noticed when the restaurant manager appeared. A man in his 50s, dressed in a neatly pressed uniform, his lip curled in distaste. Hey, you can't sleep here. Michael blinked, still disoriented. The manager's face twisted further when he noticed the empty bottle beside him. Are you deaf? Get up, old man. You're driving away my customers. Michael pushed himself upright, his head pounding. I don't care. You either leave or I'll make you leave. Michael knew how this worked. He had been chased off 1,000 times. He stood slowly, his joints aching, his body screaming for rest. But his feet barely moved before he heard it, a whistle, the sharp crackle of a police radio, and then the voice. Sir, put your hands where we can see them. Michael froze. Two police officers stood just beyond the restaurant entrance. Their hands rested near their belts, their eyes already filled with disinterest. He had seen this play out before. The handcuffs, the night in jail, the loss of whatever little he had. His heart pounded. Please, he tried, his voice weak. But they weren't listening. They never did. The officer closest to him grabbed his arm. Michael winced. The cold metal of the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. This was it. Another night in a cell, another piece of himself stripped away. He was being erased all over again. Then a voice, a familiar one. Wait. Everything stopped. The officers hesitated. The restaurant manager's face paled. And then stepping out from the restaurant's golden-lit entrance was Daniel Sinclair. His expression was unreadable. Let him go. The officers exchanged a glance. Sir, this man was... I don't care, Daniel cut in, his voice cold. Let him go. Now. There was no room for argument. The officers hesitated for only a moment before finally removing the cuffs. Michael swayed on his feet. His wrists throbbed, his mind whirled. Daniel took a step forward. For the first time, Michael saw it clearly. That look, the same one from before. Not anger, not pity. Something deeper. Something personal. And as Daniel spoke, his voice softer this time, Michael felt something shift in the air between them. We need to talk. The city's hum continued around them, indifferent to the moment unfolding. Cars passed by, tires hissing against the pavement. The golden glow of the restaurant's entrance cast long shadows over the sidewalk. But for Michael, the world had gone eerily still. The officers had left. The restaurant manager had retreated inside. Now it was just him and Daniel, a businessman in a tailored suit, a homeless man in tattered rags, two men from opposite worlds. And yet, as Daniel stood there, his sharp features etched with something Michael couldn't quite decipher, it felt like something far more than a simple act of kindness had just occurred. "We need to talk," Daniel had said again. Michael licked his dry lips, glancing around as if searching for an escape. Talk? No one ever wanted to talk to him. They wanted him to move, to leave, to disappear. But there was no disgust in Daniel's expression, no irritation. There was only something close to hesitation. Then, Daniel exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw as if searching for the right words. "There's a coffee shop across the street," he said, his voice measured. "Come with me." Michael hesitated. The money Daniel had given him earlier was still crumpled in his pocket. A coffee shop, a warm place, a seat inside. His gut told him this was a mistake. Nothing good ever came from hope, and yet his feet moved. He followed Daniel across the street, each step unsteady, as if he were walking toward something he wasn't ready to face. The coffee shop was quiet, the scent of roasted beans and fresh pastries lingering in the air. It had been years since Michael had stepped inside a place like this. Years since he had been anywhere that felt safe. The warmth hit him first, a stark contrast to the cold he'd been carrying in his bones for so long. Daniel didn't speak as he ordered 2 black coffees, barely waiting for the barista to finish before leading Michael to a booth in the corner. Michael sat stiffly, suddenly aware of everything. The way people glanced at him, the way his dirty clothes stood out against the polished wood of the furniture. The way Daniel kept staring at him, he gripped the coffee cup between his hands, feeling the warmth seep into his fingers. He didn't drink, neither did Daniel. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Then, finally, Daniel spoke. 17 years, he murmured, almost to himself. He stared down at his untouched coffee, fingers drumming against the side of the cup. "That's how long you've been gone." Michael blinked. He had heard those words before, shouted at him, whispered in disgust, used to mock him. 17 years on the streets, 17 years of nothing. But the way Daniel said it now, it wasn't like that. It wasn't just an observation, it was something else. Something personal. Michael swallowed hard, his mouth dry. His voice cracked, his throat still raw from alcohol and the chill outside. "You know me." It wasn't a question. Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line. "I used to," he said. His voice was quieter now, strained, raw. Michael's stomach twisted. "Used to." The phrase settled deep in his chest, stirring something long buried beneath the years of struggle, rejection, and loneliness. His hands shook slightly as he brought the coffee to his lips, taking a slow sip, more out of habit than need. "Who are you?" he rasped. Daniel looked up. His eyes, dark, piercing, searched Michael's face. And then, softly, almost, "I'm your son." The words landed like a blow. Michael stilled. His breath hitched. His fingers tightened around the cup until it nearly cracked. He wanted to laugh, to deny it. But the moment he looked into Daniel's face, really looked, he knew. The sharp jawline, the shape of his nose, the way his eyes held something familiar, something Michael had forgotten over time. It was impossible. It was unreal. But it was true. Michael's chest tightened, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. His mind scrambled for answers, for a way to make sense of this moment. His son, the child he had held in his arms, the boy he had read bedtime stories to, the one who had looked up at him with pure, unconditional love. Now, a man who was staring at him as if he had spent his entire life waiting for this moment. Michael's breath came in short gasps. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. No, that... But the photo slid across the table before he could finish. A small, faded photograph, edges worn, slightly crumpled. Michael's fingers trembled as he reached for it, and when he saw what it was, the air left his lungs. A younger version of himself, smiling broadly with a little boy perched on his shoulders. The boy had messy curls, a gap-toothed grin. Michael remembered that day. The park. The way the boy had laughed when Michael lifted him into the air, pretending to be an airplane. His son. The memory hit him with brutal force. His vision blurred, his chest ached. 17 years. 17 years of thinking his boy was lost to him forever. And now, here he was, sitting across from him. A man. A stranger. But still, his son. "Daniel," Michael choked out. His voice broke on the name. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Daniel's mask cracked. The carefully held composure, the businessman, the polished exterior. It shattered. His shoulders shook. His jaw clenched. And then his voice broke, too. I looked for you, he whispered, for years. I never stopped looking. Michael's breath hitched. His son had searched for him. While he had been lost in the streets, drowning in his past, wasting away in a city that didn't care, his son had never given up. The realization brought him to his knees. His chest collapsed inward. His body curled as if trying to shield itself from the weight of it all. But Daniel didn't hesitate. He reached across the table and grabbed Michael's hands. Michael flinched, not because of fear, but because it had been so long since someone had touched him without cruelty. Daniel's grip was firm, warm, steady. You're not alone anymore, Daniel whispered. Michael squeezed his eyes shut. The world outside continued. Cars passing, people coming and going, life moving forward. But in that small coffee shop, a father and son sat across from each other, hands clasped over an old photograph. Two men from two different worlds, finding their way back to the only thing that had ever mattered. Shh! Each other. The coffee shop had grown quiet around them, the sounds of clinking cups and hushed conversations fading into the background. Michael's rough, calloused hands trembled in Daniel's firm grasp. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. There were no words strong enough to bridge the 17-year gap between them. No words to erase the years of pain, the years of searching, the years of surviving. But Daniel's grip didn't loosen, and for the first time in nearly 2 decades, Michael didn't feel invisible. He felt seen, felt like someone. Finally, Daniel cleared his throat, straightening in his seat. His fingers hesitated before he pulled his hands back, but the warmth of his touch lingered against Michael's skin. You're coming home with me. Michael's heart stumbled. Home? The word felt foreign. Strange. He hadn't had a home in years. The streets had been his home, the cold pavement, the benches, the alleyways. Daniel nodded, as if the decision had already been made. Final, absolute. Yes, home. Michael swallowed. He wanted to protest, to say he didn't belong in whatever world his son lived in now, that he wasn't the same man he used to be, that he had nothing to offer. But Daniel was already sliding out of the booth, pulling a sleek car key fob from his pocket. Come on, he said softly. Let's go. And maybe it was the exhaustion, or maybe it was the sheer miracle of sitting across from his son after all these years. But Michael didn't argue. He just nodded and let Daniel lead him home. The SUV moved silently through the city, swallowing the distance between the streets and a world Michael no longer recognized. The deeper they drove into Chicago's wealthiest district, the more out of place Michael felt. The towering glass buildings, the gated mansions, the kind of world where men like Daniel lived and men like Michael didn't. His reflection in the tinted window looked wrong. The layers of filth, the ragged clothes, the unshaven face, they didn't belong here. This is a mistake, Michael murmured. His fingers gripped his tattered sleeves, suddenly ashamed of his appearance. I don't belong in your world, Daniel. Daniel's hands tightened on the wheel. You're my father, he said firmly. That's all that matters. Michael looked away, his throat burned. Did it really? Did it really matter? After all these years? Then the SUV slowed. Michael glanced up, and his breath caught. Daniel's home wasn't just a house, it was a mansion, a sprawling estate nestled behind towering wrought iron gates. The driveway stretched wide, lined with perfectly manicured trees. The house itself gleamed beneath the soft golden light spilling from the massive windows, its elegant architecture looking like something out of a magazine. Michael couldn't move. This is where you live, he whispered. Daniel pulled the car to a stop and turned toward him. It's where you live now, too. Michael's chest ached. It wasn't that he didn't want to believe it, it was that he couldn't. After so many years of being treated like nothing, it was impossible to accept that someone, even his own son, could still see him as worthy of something more. Daniel didn't push. He simply opened the door, stepping out into the cool night air. Michael hesitated. Then he followed. The moment Michael stepped inside, warmth wrapped around him. The scent of polished wood, the soft glow of expensive lighting, the sheer size of it all. It was overwhelming. His feet barely touched the pristine marble floors. A man in a suit approached. Daniel's assistant, Robert Harrison, his expression carefully neutral, though Michael caught the flicker of surprise in his eyes. "Mr. Turner," Robert greeted Daniel, "I've prepared the guest room as requested, and the bath." A bath. Michael's stomach twisted. It had been so long since he'd had a proper bath that he had forgotten what it felt like to be clean. Daniel nodded, his gaze steady. "Thank you, Robert." Then, turning to Michael, soft but firm. "Go on, Dad. Get cleaned up. I'll be waiting." Michael swallowed thickly. His eyes burned. He didn't know what to say. So he said nothing and followed Robert down the long, winding hallways. For the first time in years, he took a bath. The warm water eased the aches in his bones. The steam washed away the grime of the streets. And when he finally stepped out, changed into the comfortable clothes Robert had left for him, he barely recognized the man in the mirror. When Michael returned to the main hall, Daniel was waiting. A single steaming bowl of soup sat on the dining table. Michael's stomach clenched painfully. The scent alone nearly brought him to his knees. Daniel smiled softly. "It's been a long time," he said, pushing the bowl toward him. "Eat, Dad." Michael hesitated only a moment before picking up the spoon. The first sip was almost unbearable because it tasted like home, and Michael had forgotten what home felt like. He set the spoon down, blinking rapidly. Daniel said nothing. He simply sat beside him, patient, understanding. And for the first time in 17 years, Michael ate a meal without shame. Later that night, after dinner, Michael wandered. The house was too big, too perfect, too much. And yet his feet carried him to a room at the end of the hall, a room with a grand piano. Michael stopped. He hadn't played in years. He had forgotten the feel of the keys beneath his fingers. But had he? His hands hovered over the polished surface. A memory surfaced, small hands pressed against his own, a child's laughter. "Teach me, Dad." Michael's chest ached. And before he could stop himself, he played. The melody was rough at first, his fingers stiff and hesitant. But as the notes filled the quiet house, something shifted inside him. His body remembered, his soul remembered. A single tear slipped down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. Behind him, Daniel watched. His eyes shone with something Michael couldn't name. Hope, maybe. Or maybe forgiveness. And for the first time in 17 years, Michael allowed himself to believe in the possibility of something more. A second chance. A new beginning. If this story moved you, do like, subscribe, comment, and share it with someone.